Okay, good morning to everybody. We are ready to get started. Today is the 6th, and so what we're going to do today is we're going to be covering some of the content of Chapter 16. And just to give a brief look-see here at the syllabus I put up on the screen, and this is just my own version that I save and I use, and I've got things in red if I'm currently covering them, and if I've already covered them, then I sort of bold them and say, okay, I've gotten past that, moved on. So chapter 16 is what we're going to cover today. It's an important chapter. It's one that I wasn't sure if I was going to actually get to. And I think I mentioned to the class on a couple of occasions that I hope we get there, that I wasn't sure that we have the opportunity to get to this issue of foreign exchange, because it really is important. And I know that occasionally macro courses may not have, in our macro courses, at least sometimes we can get there and sometimes we can't. But it's something that impacts a lot of us, particularly if all your connection to international trade is maybe going to another country on vacation, or maybe buying foreign goods, which is something very common to a lot of us. But even traveling overseas, or even to somewhere like Mexico, who has a different currency, would have or Canada, even these neighboring countries, would have an impact on your ability to engage in purchasing power based upon the relative strength or weakness of the currency. And we're going to talk a bit about this idea of currency strength and currency weakness, and how it's maybe not quite what it is made out to be, because sometimes I think we don't always think clearly about what these terms refer to, and we probably ought to rethink them when we talk about them in the popular media and whatnot. But we're going to cover that today. And then when we come back next week, and I'm trying to swivel the camera back over here, and all these rooms are different in terms of which direction you have to move the little buttons on the camera. So I apologize for moving one way and then having to adjust. So next week we're going to cover chapter 17. This is an important chapter also, and it sort of wraps up where we're going in the class. And we're going to talk about fiscal policy. Remember, we talk about, as I said, this final section of the class deals a lot with policy, and that is the idea of where does government fit in to the macroeconomy in terms of stabilization. That is, does the government have a role to play? And if so, how constructive, and in what ways can it influence the ups and downs of the business cycle? And I think we made the case earlier on that the business cycle was sort of inevitable. And we go up, and rise, fall, level off, fall again, rise and whatnot. And so we've not yet really figured out how to make a straight line of economic growth. And I don't think there's probably any way to make that happen. But there is a way to bring down the ups and downs of those business cycles. And I think that policy has been provably successful at that. Just if you look at the ups and downs of the economy prior to really activist government beginning of the 1930s, I think you'll see that there were lots of really huge economic dislocations, a lot of which have been smoothed out over time, which is not to say that we don't have the occasional hiccups. And we had some bank failures about 3 weeks ago. But I think those are, and I know there was some fear that there would be contagion. It would spill over into the broader economy, or at minimum into banks, the banking system as a whole. But it turns out not to have really been so much the case. And we'll see what happens as interest rates continue to go up, and whether or not banks are going to be subject to further contagion. But time will tell. But there's no question that the government, through its fiscal operations, budget operations, can have a role to play at stabilizing the economy. And also, as we'll cover in chapter 17, it's got a role to play, particularly, and there's also discussed in chapter 15 in terms of financial stabilization. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on with that. Then when we come back on a week from today, the 13th, we'll talk about the fourth exam. So our fourth exam is scheduled for next week, and it'll be available from probably Thursday through Saturday or through Sunday. So you'll have until the 16th in order to do that. And I know it seems like these exams are kind of coming quickly, but just keep in mind that this is the only activity we've got that is subject to assessment in this course, that we don't have quizzes or papers or presentations or anything like that. I want to do papers, and I don't think it's particularly good for a 200 level, for an intro macro course, to have you start writing papers. I just don't think that I don't think that's a great way to learn econ starting out. So I think this is probably the best medium for that. But hopefully you will do well in the fourth exam. When we come back from that, assuming that everyone has taken the fourth exam, which is probably unlikely, which is why I didn't really write it here on the board. if everyone's taking the fourth exam, I'll go over that exam as well on the 18th, which is the Tuesday of the final week of class. You can believe it. I know the weather doesn't feel like we're in spring, but it's the final week. And we'll talk about the first three exams, and I'll just basically go over them. And this entire week, it's week 15, this is really your week. And I know instructors say that a lot, and it sounds very glib and very insincere, but I really mean it. Bring your questions. And even if you're on the Zoom call, feel free to speak up. I mean, most of you look at it, they mute yourself and turn your camera off, and that's perfectly fine. I think I kind of prefer people do mute themselves just so we don't pick up dogs and background noise and all that. But don't think that should inhibit you from asking questions, jumping in and bringing your questions or requests for me to show something, to illustrate something that maybe is bugging you, particularly if it goes back even if it goes back to the first or second week of class. Feel free to do that. This is your chance to get straightened out things that you really want to have covered. And then, so we'll talk about those. I don't think everyone will have taken the exam for it. It's just my experience, with a big enough class that someone's probably going to not do it. If for no other reason, the fact that there may be people who are inactive in the course that have simply, whatever, fallen off the grid. It does happen. It's regrettable, but it does happen. So it's going to be unlikely that I'll be able to go over that. I do make these available to you in Brightspace. And I know that this was a question that came up in one of my other sections. It was an Attend Anywhere section where somebody said, how do I look at the old exams? And I usually make those available a week or the day after the makeup period is expired. It's usually the Monday following the Monday of the exam, the Monday following the Monday of the exam, because that week is a makeup week. Now, if everyone's taken it, I'll usually just sort of move that ahead, but usually that's not the case. And if you don't know how to get to that, maybe let me know and I'll give you some better directions. My view is a little bit different. I see things a little bit differently in Brightspace than what you do. And I know I've tried to walk people through it, and your screens are a little different, so it's difficult for me to tell you exactly what to click and where to go, but it shouldn't be terribly difficult. I've had some people ask how to do it, but if you really are just unable to locate it, just let me know and we'll work it out. It's not like it's some deep dark secret. I mean, it's just that Brightspace is still somewhat new to us, and so we're still trying to find out a lot of the tricks and tools that are involved there. And so give us a little bit, just give me the opportunity to sort of work with you on that. We'll talk on the very last day about the final exam. Also, I wanted to mention to you as well, if for whatever reason you want to take the final exam in class, maybe you think that you're around during that weekend and you don't want to miss the exam because there's really no opportunity to do a makeup of the final. I mentioned this the first day of class, and also it's in the syllabus. It's probably unlikely you'll have a chance to do a makeup simply because of the fact that we've got of the final exam, that is, because we've got a very tight time frame for reporting grades. They've got to be in very quickly after the semester ends. So, I mean, it's not impossible, but it's going to be difficult. So if you want to take a paper exam in class or wherever, feel free to let me know, or in the testing center, let me know, and we'll have that arranged. And so I can do that on that Thursday. I can do it whenever is good for you. So just let me know, okay? And I think if anything, I'm accommodating people's needs, and just let me know what it is, if you want to do that. And then sometimes it does come up, and I know it. And I think I'm trying to be sensitive to the idea that sometimes people's internet is not always that reliable. I know I've had some internet issues in my house, and for whatever reason, the last couple of days, and I was up late last night putting this together because my internet was up and down. It finally came up, and I don't know what was going on, but something was afoot. So I realized there were these issues. Okay, so questions for me before we get started. Anybody on the Zoom call? Okay, well, I hope you can see this on your screen there. I've got the camera and the angles aren't the best, I realize, but I told you that we keep coming back to the circular flow model, and I certainly keep referring to it again and again in this class. It's the idea of these relationships among the economic actors. In the domestic economy, it's business firms, governments, and households, nothing new there. These two actors together constitute the private sector. Government and all its agencies are the public sector. And there's another important part of the private sector called the financial industry that we've been talking a little bit about in this class. And it's the idea that it serves as, and we would typically refer to them as, yes, you might hear the term financial institutions, which is sort of the formal way that we might think of them as sort of how they're constructed legally. But From a macroeconomic perspective, we call them intermediaries, because what do? They basically end up channeling savings to credit. And that's really one of their key functions, is this channeling of savings to credit. And what is important about it is the fact that it's both households and firms that provide savings to the financial system, which and the core of that is the commercial banking system. We've been talking about a bit about that, going back to chapter 14 and also into chapter 15. And then also they serve an important role, and that is this channeling of credit goes in this direction here. When we're talking about business firms, we're talking about this idea that business firms also buy things from other business firms. And so as a result, we've got investment spending, which is one of the key elements of being able to buy things. And then also a lot of durable goods spending is financed by borrowing. So as a result, we've got that going on. Also, though, there's another important issue here, and that's the idea that government borrows money from the private sector as well. And so there's lots of money being borrowed by the federal government. Let's leave that aside just for a minute, because we're going to talk more about that next week on Tuesday when we get into the fiscal policy and whatnot. Today, I think what I'm more interested in is international trade and the idea particularly of currency flows across international boundaries. I'll remind you once again that when we talk about goods flows, we've got goods coming in and goods leaving, right? Goods coming in, we simply refer to as imports. Obviously, that's not a new term. We'll simply refer to it as M. And I know that I've said this before. It's a particular area of irritation to some of us that economists don't always use the same algebraic symbols to represent everything like we probably ought to, like chemists do and whatnot. But I know M is also used for money and whatnot. And sometimes you'll see this as IM and whatnot. But anyway, we know what those are. And then goods going out are exports, which we probably know. We simply call those X. And then we have reciprocal currency flows that go out the other direction. So as imports come in, import payments go out. So import payments go out. And so these are dollar flows. And that's how I represent those in green. And then as exports go out, money flows come back into firms. And these are export payments. This is not probably new, at least it should not be new, because we've talked about this before. And that is this idea of the balance of trade between any country and the rest of the world. And one of the things that I think is important is that if we back up a little bit and say, okay, this is, let's say, the US economy. But by the way, this particular model it can be used to represent any economy, the Chinese economy, the Japanese economy, the British economy, whatever. This is not any particular novel explanation of how an economy works. And again, as with all models, we can add things, take things away, pick and choose what we put on here. And as I mentioned, when we first started talking about circular flow models, I said that if you were to Google the term circular flow, first of all, you had millions of hits, quite literally, but you'd have all these, some of these very elaborate ones with all kinds of flows of things going around. You had loans from the International Monetary Fund and things that we're not really going to get into here. Things like, interbank transfers between nations and whatnot. These are not things covering in this particular class. And so we're scaling some of this down, frankly, but we want to focus on these flows, the imports and exports, and the dollar flows in particular. So what would differ is, if we're talking about the Japanese economy, the Canadian economy, or whatever, is that these wouldn't be dollars, they might be yen or Canadian dollars or whatever the case might be. And remember that when we talked about this difference between exports and imports, it really represents the trade balance, okay? This is the balance of trade, which has an impact on GDP. And again, if we had and this is X minus M. So if X is greater than M, then we have a trade surplus. Again, we've covered this before, but it bears repeating. So we have a trade surplus, meaning that this term here is positive. So we have a positive term here, and if that's positive, it brings GDP up. So countries that have positive trade surpluses with all of their trading neighbors on a net basis. When I say on net basis, meaning that, let's say the US economy might have a surplus with France, let's say. And that is, we're selling more to France than we're buying from France. But we buy a lot more from Saudi Arabia and Japan and China. So as a result, that deficit outweighs the surplus. And so we have a net deficit in terms of balance of trade. Well, we're going to talk a bit about those individual deficits and how currencies play a role in that. We're talking about the net difference that it says, as all these things are sort of washed out, okay? On the other hand, if exports are less than imports, we have what's known as a trade deficit. And I think we've covered the idea that the US economy for a very long time has been in a trade deficit. And here, a negative sign on this. And as a result, GDP comes down when a country has a negative trade. Simply the difference between the value of exports and the value of imports. And X and M are simply goods flows and service flows. They're goods and service flows back and forth. But we measure the value of anything, obviously in economics, by the dollars or the yen or the euro or whatever that we're trying to assess. And so remember, if you simply go back to our expenditures formula, which is Y equals C plus I plus G, that's household spending, business spending, government spending, and we come up with this plus or minus. This could be plus or minus the net exports figure as to whether it's positive or negative. At the moment, the U.S. had, and I say at the moment, it's been the case for a better part of 60 years, we've been in a negative situation in terms of balance of trade. A lot of that historically has been due to oil imports. The U.S. economy has grown, and we've been buying and importing lots and lots of oil. And that was historically, for the last several decades, one of the big contributors to that deficit. That is not really so much the case anymore because the U.S. is pumping a lot of oil from within the United States itself. And the other thing about oil and everything connected to oil and natural gas is that it's complicated because some of that actually does get exported to other countries, even while we're importing from other countries. And some of that is actually, and some of the imports come from Canada. We import more from Canada than we do from some of the countries that are most notable that we hear about, like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other countries like that. So it's not so much oil today. Oil, as every year goes by, I think we're seeing less and less importance of oil as being a factor. Now, it could become a big factor once again if the world does not discover more oil at some point pretty soon, because pretty much the feeling is that a lot of the discoveries have been sort of all identified. And but we heard the same thing back in the 90s that, oh, we're going to run out of oil and we need to find new oil quickly and whatnot. And we end up finding lots and lots of oil, and a lot of it's underground and whatnot. And I suspect this is probably going to spur the move toward cleaner energy anyway, which probably should reverse some of this deficit because what the amount that we do import, well, obviously electricity will not have to be imported. And the thing about electricity is it's very difficult to transport in terms of international trade. It's one of those goods that is pretty much consumed as quickly as it's produced. It's difficult to store it, to store electricity for too very long chemically, and that's a different story altogether. So this is a flow. This sort of gives us a bit of a refresher as to where we're coming from. The thing that I wanted to focus on were these dollar flows and the fact that we've got connections between economies, and that international trade's been going on for a very, very, very long time. Now, your book has got a really interesting discussion, and I say it's interesting, and I really do think that that there are stories in economics that even people who hate economics and have no interest in it whatsoever, at least might find the human drama in it pretty interesting. And that's the whole drama. It's this de-linking of the gold standard, the dollar from the gold standard back in 1971. What had happened was after World War II, or actually as World War II was just winding down, the major trading nations of the world got together and met in a place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And summer of 1944 was not long after the Allied invasion of Europe. And it was pretty obvious at that point who was going to win the war. Germany was going to lose, Japan was going to lose, and the victorious nations were going to be in power. And as a result, they were going to now, these actors from around the world were going to try to construct a new economic world order. And it was based upon the United States as being the preeminent power in the world, not just militarily, but also economically. And so what was known as the world's reserve currency was established with the US dollar as the dominant currency, and it still is the dominant currency in the world today. Now you might say, okay, what do you mean dominant as opposed to it was replacing the British pound, which had been for a good couple hundred years the standard bearer of what's called the reserve currency. Now, what is a reserve currency? Because I don't think this was sufficiently addressed in the text. A reserve currency is any currency that most central banks around the world have in their possession because it's easily spendable, it's easily acceptable, and the US dollar is anything but that. And for people I know who've even gone to even some of the poorest countries on earth, people will willingly accept US dollars in exchange for pretty much anything. That's how powerful the US dollar is, probably more so ever than what the British pound was. And so Britain obviously had suffered 2 world wars and barely escaped both of them, actually, was no longer the dominant power. They were both voluntarily and involuntarily spinning off and losing part of their worldwide empire. And so clearly the financial and industrial dominance of Britain was on the wane. America's was on the rise. And so as a result, the world's preeminent currency was established at that time as the US dollar. And as a result, the US dollars, the value of the US dollar was pegged to the value of gold. Now, we've talked a bit about gold before, and we've emphasized that contrary to what I think some people probably believe, the dollar is not backed by gold any longer. It once was. It was until 1971. But even before then, it had periodically gone on, and we've gone on and off the gold standard. We went off the gold standard during the Civil War, mostly because the Civil War had to be financed, and there simply wasn't enough gold to finance it. So the U.S. Treasury just started printing dollars, and there was no central bank at the time to regulate the currency. And so we had pretty significant inflation, about 25% per year inflation in the northern states. And in the southern states, that was a whole different situation altogether because they were relying upon a very poor currency, a very weak currency, the Confederate dollar. And in fact, it's safe to say that the Confederacy wasn't that functioning of a government anyway, in terms of a central government. It never was, probably was sort of doomed to fail from the beginning. But nonetheless, from an economic and monetary standpoint, that currency was being diluted all the time, and simply because they were printing too many dollars. And the U.S. government was also counterfeiting U.S. dollars and sending them south in order to further weaken their economy, which was successful. So there are times in which gold is not the standard, it's just pieces of paper, and government just print it. And what happened in 1971 was the fact that the economies of the world were growing rapidly, and the United States, and we're going to cover this a bit more next time, the United States was spending money rapidly. And I'm going to give you a bit of charts, some charting on Tuesday about where the government spending just spiked dramatically during the 1960s and 70s on all kinds of programs, on things like social spending, the creation of things like Medicare and Medicaid, the ramping up of student assistance, the ramping up of healthcare, particularly, and all the anti-poverty programs which were created, the Vietnam War, the space program, all these things which were pushing government spending up. And as a result, the government needed dollars in order to finance those, and they were simply trying to borrow them. And the Federal Reserve was trying to catch up and printing the dollars because remember, it's the Federal Reserve that can create money as well, not just the private banks. They can do it through open market operations, or they can simply do it by dropping reserves on banks' books, which they did in 2008. But anyway, the point was we were creating more dollars than what we had gold to back it. So Richard Nixon, the president at the time, just simply delinked the dollar, uncoupled the dollar from from gold. And really, I mean, it was interesting because there was a sort of a freak out on the part of other countries because it was done without consulting other countries, which probably was a mistake. But it was done, and it was done over a weekend. It was a decision that was sort of made, and as a result, the dollar fell in value. It fell pretty substantially, and the dollar has been falling in value ever since. Now, what does that mean? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Well, we're going to talk about what these terms mean. Do they mean what we think they mean, and are they a good thing or are they a bad thing? What I want to make, though, in today's emphasis, and it's the emphasis of chapter 16, is the idea that currencies, this paper money issued by governments, can be exchangeable for other currencies. They trade their own markets. And governments got a role to play, occasionally intervening. And I was going to get into that. In fact, I put on the overview for the week in Brightspace that we would talk a bit about policy intervention. And as I got into it, I was reading the chapter readings of chapter 16. And I think it was a little bit advanced for a 200 level class. I really do think it was too much. And I think I'm not going to talk about policy intervention. I think if anybody who's really interested in that and is going to be an econ major, you'll come across it in 300 level macro. It's a much more detailed conversation, and it requires way more than what I can do in just a few minutes that I can address it. I could get onto it, but I wouldn't do it justice. And if I find in a course that I can't do it justice enough to make it make sense, I try to avoid it. And so I'm going to sort of do that. So in terms of policy intervention, that is this idea of trying to, peg currencies to other currencies. We may talk a bit about that, but not very much. Okay. So these currencies trade back and forth with each other. So you can buy Canadian dollars with US dollars and back and forth again all day long. Trillions of dollars of transacted across international boundaries. And the most common purpose is used to simply facilitate international trade. So let's talk about foreign exchange, and I'll sort of dim the lights here because I think it's going to be easier to see on the cameras. But when we talk about foreign exchange, what we're talking about here is, and the term itself is a bit misleading because it might sound like we're talking about the trade of goods. Foreign exchange refers specifically to the trade in currencies. So exchange might suggest, okay, that this is oil from, Brazil to Canada or whatever, and that's not what we're talking about. Foreign exchange is the transfer of one currency for another currency. For what purposes? Well, these are the purposes, and that is in order for, first of all, the big one, and the one that I sort of illustrate on the board, was to make payments for these cross-border transactions. That is, if you're importing goods from some other country, they clearly, and so you would pay somehow in dollars or in the currency in which those selling firms are providing their goods. It becomes a complicated discussion of how this happens. Because I know that all of us buy imported goods all the time. If we buy gasoline, we're probably buying some imported goods. There are lots and lots of goods that we simply don't produce in the US or produce in enough quantity to meet the domestic demand. And so that gap in demand is filled by imports. And this includes things like sugar and diamonds and coffee. And in fact, I don't know that we produce any coffee in the States at all. It's all imported. So at some point, a US dollars you spend at Albertsons or wherever, Walmart, has got to get converted to the Brazilian currency. Well, how does that happen? Well, it happens in a bank-to-bank sort of transfer. And international companies are very familiar with how to do this. They've been familiar with how to do it for a very, very long time. Exporting countries are used oftentimes in US dollars themselves. And this is one of the good things for being in America is the fact that most people will take a US dollar in payment. Now, there are times in which there have been some concerns about the US financial system and about the US dollar, but they've been mostly temporary and maybe a little bit exaggerated and overblown. I mean, I think that if you've been following this whole thing with the Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic Bank, that there are a lot of people on TV who will always say the sky is falling and whatnot. And I think you should take that with a grain of salt and trust me on this one because I've been around for a long time and I've heard every sky is falling warning out there. And yes, sometimes the sky really is falling, but 99 times out of 100, it's not. So this idea that the US dollar is going to lose value and the banks are teetering and tottering, well, maybe it's true, but probably not. And so US dollars are acceptable pretty much everywhere. But sometimes sellers want to be paid in their own currency. And there's some reasons for that. Like right now, it's sort of difficult to pay its trade from Russia because of the fact that the rest of the world is sort of teamed up to oppose their actions in Ukraine. So those transactions are a little bit more complicated. But even outside of that example, there are countries that don't have a very strong connection to the rest of the world, like Iran. And so as a result, we've got to get the currency converted somehow to their own particular. I can't even think about what the Iranian currency is called, but it does happen. And I remember there was a few years ago during the Obama States was, as part of the nuclear settlement with Iran to try to get them to dial down their nuclear development, the US would release, finally, after many, many decades, some of the billions of dollars that had been impounded from the nation of Iran after they had taken US hostages. This goes way, way, way back, in the 1970s, late 70s, when the government of Iran sort of approved, the new government was a revolutionary government, sort of approved the taking of US embassy staff and personnel as hostage for about like a year and a half. So the US retaliated by seizing their money overseas, which is probably an understandable reaction. Well, eventually it was released to the Iranians once they agreed to make a nuclear deal, but there was no interbank ability to make that transfer. They were not really connected to the global financial system. And so plane loads of US cash were simply flown to Iran. And I know it's very controversial. And in hindsight, maybe it could have been done differently. Maybe some temporary facility could have been set up because there are international institutions that handle intergovernmental transfers. It's called the Bank of International Settlements. But that was a very visible sign. It probably was not politically optically very pleasing to Americans to see us with plane loads of cash going to Iran, which has long been considered to be an adversary, to say the least. But nonetheless, you get the idea that some of these exchanges are not easy. However, those are unusual. The reason we even hear about them is because they're unusual. It's not difficult for us at all to buy sugar. It's just easy. And in fact, even the firms that import sugar find it easy to do. But here, it's not quite as easy as the fact that these currencies fluctuate with each other, and it has a real impact on prices paid in countries and amounts received by sellers. And that's what we're going to get into. So that's the first purpose of international exchange of foreign currencies. In the first place is to pay for goods. Second is to fund financial loans, repayments, and investments. And that is, and I sort of documented that here on the board, on the whiteboard. That's the idea that there is a lot of money flowing around in terms of investments. And your text gets into something which I think is a little bit beyond where we want to go in this course. Things like foreign direct investment. That's when companies make direct investments in other countries. And it goes on all the time. And those have got to be converted from whatever it is, yen to dollars or dollars to Chinese yuan or whatever the case might be. Those are simply investments. And sometimes they're not physical investments in plant and equipment. Sometimes they're simply investments in securities. And what's interesting is that as the international financial markets become much more integrated, and they are, it's very possible for you sitting at home, at your kitchen table, buying stock on E-Trade. You can buy a foreign stock easily. You don't have to open an account in Germany or China in order to do that. And I've long owned shares in Dutch Shell, which is a British/Dutch company. No problem. I just did it. Even though it was a foreign company, I just bought those shares. GlaxoSmithKline is a British drug company. No problem. Okay. So as we become more integrated, these transactions become easier. But loans and repayments have been going on for a very long time. Sometimes they involve government, and this is where government sometimes steps in to provide loan guarantees to private lenders and whatnot. Those are part of the picture. But typically, it's just a bank-to-bank or bank-to-borrower sort of relationship, where any bank can do business pretty much anywhere in the world and lend money to anyone. And it's mostly a function of the bigger banks. So in this country, we used to call them money center banks. Banks like Citibank and Chase and Bank of America, Wells Fargo, those are the four biggest ones in the country today. And those were the ones that would typically be involved in financing a lot of transactions, just simply lending money to whoever needed to borrow it. And you obviously have currency risk when you do that. So that is the idea that they may be repaying you in currency that's not as valuable because it's losing value. So sometimes this is why it's important to have a reserve currency so you can denominate these in dollars. Now, what's interesting about this issue of the Bretton Woods Conference, and I say that there's a lot of drama behind the events that went on from 1944 at Bretton Woods until the final decoupling from gold in 1971, was that at the Bretton Woods Conference, John Maynard Keynes, who we've talked about, proposed that there was one world currency. And I think he called it the Bangor. I don't know where that name came from, but it was a proposal. It was never adopted, but something like that has sort of happened in Europe with the euro. And I'll give you some examples of currency flows here in a minute. And I was going to do an example of the euro, and I thought, no, it's difficult because when we talk about the euro, it's complicated because it was the first step toward intergovernmental currency creation. And it took quite a long time to get underway. And frankly, I don't know that we can say there's been all that smashing of a success. There have been issues with it, frankly. But at the same time, the warnings of dire catastrophe also didn't pan out. So it's maybe been more of a success than some thought. Okay, but nonetheless, the idea that loans and investments are denominated back and forth in terms of other currencies and exchanged happens all the time. And sometimes they just simply happen in US dollars. Also, facilitating intergovernmental settlements, that should be 3. It's not a 4 there. Kind of carried over there. Let me take that out of there. But it's facilitating intergovernmental settlements. We're not going to really get into that so much, but I just want everybody to know that is a potential issue there. Okay. All right. Let's talk a bit about currency strength. So let me do this. I pulled up here before class a converter, a currency converter. Hope everyone can see this. And this is there are numerous. The beauty of disposal today is there are numerous websites you can get to with all kinds of data and all kinds of tools that are for free. And I mean, we have more tools at our disposal than people did just a few years ago, and it's available to you. And so we can easily get the conversion of one currency for another. The example I'm going to use in this class is the Japanese yen, which is yen is the currency in Japan, versus the US dollar. Okay, and so the conversion rate is 1 yen will buy 0.76 of a penny. Okay, a fraction of a penny. So yens have traditionally been worth much less per dollar. But when we say this, this is not to, it has no particular meaning necessarily. It really doesn't. And I mean, when we say it's worth a fraction of a penny, well, we know that a yen is nowhere near worth $1 in terms of a 1-to-1 ratio. But that doesn't make any difference. What is more important is what has been the change in that ratio over time. One thing I can tell you is that if you go back to 30 or 40 years ago, before Japan really came into its own as being a really major exporter, where in terms of that last term in the expenditures approach, that whether it's a plus or a negative, positive or negative, net exports, they've been positive for many decades. But as they're ramping up, the Japanese yen became to become much more prominent, and it grew in terms of strength. 1 yen might only buy a fraction of a penny, and I like to do this just because here's the thing. But over time, and I was trying to find historical charts, and unfortunately they don't go back, but there was a time in which the yen was worth much less per dollar than what it is now, and it's gained in strength. And we'll talk about why it's gained in strength. It simply has a lot to do with the exchange of goods. It's simply a demand and supply issue. So you can also turn this around and say, what is a yen worth in US dollar terms? If I can find it, let me see if I don't want the Antillian guilder. I don't even know what that is. I want it here. I'm trying to find the US dollar. Let me do this. Let me go this direction here. Japanese yen and US dollar. I can see it. I was able to do this earlier, and I can't seem to track it down. I'm trying to find the American dollar. Where is it? Oh, here we go. It's went past US dollar. Okay, so we can reverse it and go the other direction. Now, here's the calculation. It's simply this. If 1 yen was worth 0.7 of a cent, then what is $1 worth in terms of it's 1 over 0.76. All you do is you simply take the reciprocal. Very easy transaction. If ever you want to know what is a Canadian dollar, US dollars, just find out what the conversion is. And then if you want to convert it the other direction, just go 1 over that ratio, whatever it is. It's a very simple calculation to make. So $1 will buy 131 yen. I say that the yen has gained in strength over time. It's because of the fact that if you go back about $1 used to buy like 400 yen. And that was the yen was a much weaker currency, but has gained in strength. Now, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? It sounds like if you're Japanese, hey, it's awesome, we got a strong currency. But maybe not. We'll talk about that. There are pros and cons to both a strong and a weak currency. But that's how the conversion happens. So, and you can do this with any class of currencies, and you've got so many different kind of currencies up here. So like, take a look at this. The US dollar will buy 0.8 of a British pound. If you were to simply do the math on this is pretty easy. If you do this, 1 divided by 0.8, you're going to get 125, meaning it would cost that 1 British pound is worth $1.25. A British pound is worth more on a 1-to-1 basis than the US dollar. But the British pound, I know when I was a kid, we have relatives who live in Britain. The US dollar was worth about 5. It used to cost about 5 British pounds. The pound has come down in value dramatically, and by the way, it's been falling since Great Britain left the Eurozone, the international trade zone in Europe. It recovered a little bit, but it just got clobbered right after the British voted to remove themselves from that currency zone. And so you see that these are not constant over time. And we're talking about the difference between one Japanese yen being, or $1 being worth 130 Japanese yen today, and back in time it was 400 yen. That's a big difference. So international trade has got to be adjusted for those. And 1 British pound over time, and I know it was a while since I've been a kid, but today, it's $1.25 will buy a pound. It used to take $5 to buy a British pound. So these are big changes over time. And companies that do business overseas have to make these adjustments, and they have to do planning for it. This is another complication of doing business in the world because there is no single global currency. Now, does that sound like a great idea? Because these fluctuations, they have real impacts on GDP. And I'm not talking about even real versus nominal. I'm talking about real impacts on income, employment, and all these kinds of things, and even in some cases, inflation rates. And it really does make a big difference over time. And so it's just another complicating factor because there is no single global currency, and there is no metals backing for these major currencies. So we talk about currency strength. Let's talk about this because sometimes I think we get our wires crossed here logically when we think about the strength of a currency. A quote unquote strong currency is one which simply buys more units of another currency than it could last week, week before, last year, whatever. So if it takes fewer dollars to buy yen, it means the dollar is rising in value against the yen. The example I'm going to be using is the Japanese yen here. I was going to use euro, but when I say that, it becomes a little bit difficult because not every country in Europe is part of the Eurozone. There are some pretty major countries that are not part of the Eurozone. Switzerland's not part of the Eurozone, neither is Norway, neither is Turkey. There are some major countries in Europe that do not belong, neither is Britain for that matter. And so as a result, the euro is not widely, so I can't say if I'm buying from European companies because not all European companies belong to the Eurozone. So I use the Japanese yen. So if the US dollar buys more yen today than it did last week, then we say that the dollar is strengthening against the yen. And a weaker currency is one which buys fewer units of another currency than previously. It takes more dollars to buy yen. In other words, I get fewer yen per dollar. That means my currency, the dollar, is weaker against the yen than it was previously. Whatever that previous condition is, or even the minute before. And the trade in international currencies is constant. It goes on 24 hours a day. And the reason it goes on 24 hours a day is because of the fact that somewhere it's daylight somewhere and somebody's operating and somebody is trading currencies. And so this is one of the few markets in the world that never shuts down. It doesn't shut down because there's somebody up and awake and doing business somewhere. You can't say that about the stock market. You can't say that about the oil market or the grain market or any market, or even the grocery market. You know, that something usually closes down domestically, but this is one that's open. So weak currency is one that over time buys fewer dollars or fewer currency than before. And we talk about this, and strong versus weak is a little bit misleading because it sounds like, hey, strong is good, but maybe not so good. Or weak is bad, but maybe not. And we'll talk about what some of the implications are for that. And the implications are more than simply financial. They are really economic in nature. And so let's talk about some of the implications. And again, let's take the example of the Japanese yen. I think it's a good example. Japan is a major trading partner of the US. Japan is very active in the world, trading with all kinds of countries. And it's a real success story globally, economically for Japan, because this is a country that's pretty small geographically, but has a very large population. But they're also blessed with a very advanced workforce and very good management. But they don't have very much in the way of natural resources. And so they have long traded with the rest of the world to get the things that they need to have. And they traded what they have. And what we call comparative advantage. They do what they do best, and they simply buy from others what they do less well. That is true economic modernization. And it's a real success story. It has been adopted and copied by other countries successfully. This was a country that was for the most part destroyed in World War II, as was Germany, by the way, which is even more remarkable. But two of the countries that just got flattened after the last World War, have made a comeback, and they've done it primarily through trade, not just trade, but also their own good management and skilled workforces, but also through trading with other countries. Okay, so I bring up the Japanese situation because I think it's very relevant. So if we have a strong dollar, okay, and I want to talk, these are the implications. A strong dollar versus the yen means the Japanese-made goods are less expensive to American buyers. And so that's good. So if you're traveling to Japan, it means your dollars will go further. And that's a good thing because, a lot of goods in Japan are fairly expensive relative to our experience here in the US. Rents are sky high, hotel rooms are high, meals are high. They don't produce a lot of their own food. It's mostly imported, with the exception of things like seafood and rice. A lot of it's imported. So it's expensive, but if the dollar is rising in value, it means it's less expensive. But Japanese sellers are disadvantaged as a result, particularly if it crosses international boundaries because they're going to sell fewer goods. The quantity of units will go down if those, the quantity of units will go up, but they'll get less of a price for it simply because they're going to be, they're not going to get as much. Sellers are disadvantaged in the sense that if our currency is strong, it means necessarily the flip side to that equation is that remember it literally is the flip side. It's 1 over that currency value that Japanese sellers are going to be at a disadvantage selling to American buyers. Why? Because because those goods are simply going to be they're going to be cheaper for U.S. buyers, but it's not going to be necessarily good for sellers. Okay, American-made goods are more expensive to Japanese buyers if the dollar is strong. That means Japanese buyers are going to pay more for their particular goods, and as a result, American sellers are disadvantaged because they're not going to be able to sell as many to Japanese sellers simply because Japanese buyers won't be able to afford them as much. So when you've got a strong currency, it might not be such a good thing. It might not be such a good thing from that perspective. American sellers are at a disadvantage. This is why, by the way, that sometimes countries and companies do lots of trade will sometimes argue for weaker currency policies so that they can sell more goods abroad. And so strong and weak are a little bit misleading. Let's take the other part of this equation. If we have a weak dollar, and we'll just take the yen as an example, and I'm not singling out Japan just as for any particular purpose, other than the fact it's a particularly relevant example, and it's one that is easy to sort of understand, particularly more easier than I think the euro example, where not all countries are in the eurozone. A weaker dollar means Japanese goods are more expensive to American buyers. That discourages Americans from buying Japanese-made goods, which is a disadvantage to Japanese buyers trying to sell to Americans. So a weaker dollar means our dollar goes less far, and so as a result, we can't buy as many Japanese-made goods. Same time, though, our goods are less expensive to Japanese buyers, and so this is good for American sellers. So this is why, on occasion, some companies have argued for a weakening in currency policies. Now, I know I'm not really going to get into, I mentioned this at the outset, I'm not really going to get into currency policy so much, but there are occasions in which governments can and do intervene in currency valuation so as to influence the balance of trade within the country. And there was an interesting discussion in your book. Milton Friedman was quoted, and I know we've discussed Friedman and talked a bit about his work. And I know that we sort of, I touched a bit on the quantity theory of money last time, or not last time, but back in the chapter 13 discussion. I went and included that in the PowerPoint slides that were for last week, even though we didn't specifically talk about them. We'll probably circle back to them as we get going a bit later. But the point about Friedman was that he talked about currency policies and said that, look, a floating currency is probably best because, remember, in the classical view of the economy, things are stable. If they're out of whack for whatever reason, they'll get themselves back in whack. And so as a result, just like currencies float against other currencies, you don't need a lot of government intervention. And by the way, I think by now, if you've seen the video that I posted the link to or saw it in class or read about Friedman, he was big on saying that sometimes government can do too much. And it's one thing for government to do the right things, but it's a whole other thing when government does too much and is doing the wrong things. And one of the wrong things is intervening in currency translation, what we call currency translation, is trying to mess with the equation of exchange as it relates to currencies going abroad. Because sometimes countries do that. And in fact, there was, I know President Trump, when he was in office, sort of never let this idea go that China was manipulating its currency downwards so as to improve its trade position, making Chinese-made goods less expensive abroad relative to those countries that were trading with it. Now, at one time, that was probably true, but I think that China had sort of gotten the idea that you don't want to weaken your currency too much, because why? It just simply goes back to something we talked about a long time ago, and that's if you weaken your currency, you can get an inflationary condition going on in your economy. Remember, if money is losing value, that's an inflationary condition. If it's losing value, it takes more dollars to buy the same goods, and so that's inflationary. So it can be inflationary domestically. The other point that was made in the text, which I thought was a good one and particularly timely one, was the idea that it can weaken financial institutions. Why? Because remember, one of the purposes of international trade that we talked about at the very outset of today's class was facilitating loans and repayments abroad. Loans and repayments. Loans have got to be repaid, obviously. Well, if you're a lender and you're lending money in whatever currency it is, and you're being repaid in, let's say it's US dollars, and you're lending to another country and they're repaid in US dollars, well, those dollars are becoming worth less and less and less all the time, particularly if your country is pushing down the value of the dollar. So you're losing as a lender if that happens. And so you don't necessarily want that to happen. So there are complications with this. But in terms of strength, the last point I want to make on this particular topic is this. The idea of strong sounds great, weak sounds bad, but it's not necessarily the case. Yes, the Chinese probably were engaged in currency manipulation for a time in the 90s and early 2000s. But the indications are that now they no longer are doing it because it's probably inflationary. And so as a result, I think and China has come very quickly to its prominence in the global financial system. So I think they're very sophisticated and have understood that is not a long-run proposition that will work. Britain for many, many years, Great Britain for a lot of years pushed down the value of the pound. Remember, I said the pound was worth a lot more versus a single US dollar. One of the reasons why is the British government itself was pushing the value of the pound down so they could increase exports abroad of the goods that they produced. And it was simply a trade policy which was used to boost that net exports figure. Because if you raise net exports, you raise GDP. If you raise GDP, you raise incomes. By the way, if you raise incomes, you raise more tax dollars. And so there are reasons why governments want to intervene in currencies. And that's about all I'll really get into there. But the idea is that most currencies are floating, which is not to say that sometimes currencies that are weak won't be tied to the value of some other currency. And the best example of that I can think of, the most recent example, is that of Mexico a few years ago. Mexico is a complicated situation because it's both a very modern economy and also a very rural economy in very many ways. But it has had a somewhat shaky financial system for a long time, and the peso has sort of bounced around. And at one time, frankly, there was sort of a run on the peso, like a bank run where everyone's wanting to get out of the peso. The peso was falling in value against other major currencies. And the Mexican government finally, with intervention from the International Monetary Fund, which is a global agency that helps to stabilize currencies, decided, look, let's just peg the peso to the value of the US dollar. We will go up and down with the US dollar. And it immediately stabilized the peso. And it was good for the Mexican economy. And that linkage was good. I don't know that it was maybe politically that popular in Mexico to do that, but it certainly was, from an economic and monetary standpoint, it certainly made sense to do so. And other countries have done that as well. That is, latch on to the world's reserve currency, and as a result, you will stabilize your currency as well. So, and one reason why you have these reserve currencies is to do these kinds of things, stabilize other currencies. Not only that, but also to pay for goods like oil, which is always denominated in dollars, and gold, which is denominated in dollars. But these are goods that have direct utility, and so people will want to buy them. And by the way, if you looked at gold lately, gold is just surging in value. It's just incredible. We're almost approaching a record price for gold, which is usually not a very good sign for the economy generally, but they're denominated in US dollars. Okay, so strength might not be what it is cracked up to be. If a dollar is strong, it's probably going to bring down GDP. So here are the implications of it. The impact of a dollar strength on trade. So a stronger dollar does what? And again, we can take this individually, and I point out the differences, the comparison currency to currency. I just use dollar yen, you use dollar yuan as the Chinese currency, or dollar or pound or whatever. But if we're talking about relative to all other currencies, if it's strong, it reduces US exports because it makes US goods more expensive. If it reduces US exports, it tends to increase imports, both of which have the impact of declining net exports. And so if that right side of the equation is going down, then the left side of the equation is going down too, and that's GDP, and that's income, and that's personal income, and it's employment, it's all those things. So countries that run chronic trade deficits are creating a drag on their economy every time they import goods or fail to export goods. So, and I know that I've talked about this before, but every time we buy and import a good, we're actually doing a little bit of brake tapping on the US economy. And I say that not to sort of lay down the guilt trip on us, because we all buy gasoline and sugar and bananas and things which aren't made here. But it does have that effect of slowing down the economy because we're financing foreign sellers' output to a greater degree than what foreign buyers are financing our own output here. Okay? So a strong dollar, it might sound like a great thing, and I guess it is if you're trying to stop inflation, bringing down U.S. income and employment. On the other hand, a weak dollar relative to the currencies increases U.S. exports. Why? Because it makes U.S. goods less expensive to foreign buyers. It also reduces imports in the U.S. because it makes those goods more expensive to American buyers, both of which have the same effect, and the opposite effect as the previous scenario, where it raises net exports. If the right side of that expenditures equation goes up, the left side, as GDP, also goes up. And that means greater employment, higher incomes, higher personal incomes, and all those kinds of things. So it's a rise in GDP. This issue has been one. This is why the British pushed the value of their currency down, why the Chinese were probably manipulating their currency downward. I say dollar here just because I'm sort of viewing this from the U.S. perspective, but any country that would manipulate currency downward would do so probably in order to increase exports and at the same time reduce imports. Remember, they're the flip side of the same equation, basically. So as a result, you could boost your economy by doing that. And there are a lot of countries in the world that have deliberately done that. At the same time that currency was weakening, they were increasing the rest of the world. So there's no question that Japan was trying to push the value of the yen downward. And the reason it wasn't inflationary was because a lot of the goods they were producing went overseas. They weren't even available for sale in Japan. So as a result, it was a successful strategy for them. I know that not every country in the world, because pushing their currency down meant that other currencies were strong as a result. So that was a difficult proposition for the rest of the world to accept. And I know that there was a lot of controversy over Japan's policies for many, many years. And by the way, right now, a similar thing is happening in the Eurozone. And what's interesting about the euro, this currency however many countries it belong to, I think it's maybe 13 or maybe it's more, that European countries that belong to it have a single currency. That, it had lots of starts and stops, and it looked like it wasn't going to happen, that these traditional currencies like the Italian lira, the French franc, the German mark, they're all going to go away and be replaced by a single continental currency. But it did eventually happen in the late 90s. And so now it's the currency you would use when transacting business. Second most traded currency behind the US dollar. And some have thought, well, maybe it's becoming a reserve currency in its own right. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know what the future of the euro is going to be. In some cases, I will tell you that there's maybe been some buyer's remorse on the part of some countries, and I'm thinking Greece in particular. Greece had some severe financial difficulties a few years ago, to the point where what was interesting, and I don't know how true the story is, but it makes for a good, interesting sort of newspaper story, but apparently the prime minister of Greece at one point was so fed up with trying to deal with his partners in the Eurozone, and they're basically telling them how to run their economy so as to fall into line with some of the policies that the Eurozone mandated. But he actually called down to the Treasury and wanted to know where the printing plates were so they could start printing drachma. That was the old currency. The Greek drachma was the currency. They could start printing those again and just leave the Eurozone, be on their own once again. And that would allow them to borrow their own currency and all this kind of thing. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen, but it was, and maybe it was more of a mythical threat than anything else, but you get the idea that they're part of it. And I know Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, who won the Nobel Prize for primarily his work on trade, has pointed out that there is conflict within the Eurozone right now, particularly over Germany's role. And Germany is a major exporting country. They're also a member of the Eurozone. Now, typically what would happen is, and your text gets into this a lot more than what I'm going to here, and probably, this is why I'm sort of picking and choosing which topics in that chapter to talk about. Some of it, I think, frankly, does get into a little bit higher level material that I don't think is really, it's really something you want to even get into. But Krugman talked about this idea of Germany running these huge deficits or these surpluses with the rest of the world, selling. It's been one of their policies, economic policies, and has been since the end of World War II, to boost their economy by engaging in trade. They make a lot of goods, or goods available for sale elsewhere in the world. The rest of the world snaps them up. And what would have happened is that at some point, the value of the old currency, the German mark, would have risen in value. And that would have slowed down trade, and it would have reduced their deficit. Because remember, a stronger currency tends to reduce exports. So if we're simply saying a strong mark, in this case, the old German mark would have reduced German exports and increased imports into Germany, right? All we're doing is simply changing the terms here. And so as a result, they would have, but because there's one single currency, that Germany's been sort of a free rider here in the sense that they are exporting, but they don't suffer the consequences of a higher currency as a result. And it's thought to be a disadvantage to other countries in the Eurozone because they're not benefiting in the other direction. That is, a stronger mark means they can sell more to Germany because they do trade a lot. And that's part of the purpose of the euro, was to facilitate trade between these countries. And that's been going on for a long time, even prior to the euro. But that's an interesting idea, is this idea of conflict within the Eurozone. So I don't know, I think the euro will probably survive, but the idea of moving to a global currency is probably not one single global currency. That is, it's probably not on the horizon. I just don't really see it happening. And then the final thing I want to talk about is some of the causes of exchange rate fluctuations. So this will be the last topic that I've got here. And interesting is your book gets into a lot of the supply-demand dynamics. I'm not going to really get into here because it's really, we just don't have time for it, and it's interesting, but it's something that if you really are interested, we can talk about. But primarily, what are some of the main causes? There are others besides this, but these are the big ones. First of all, is expectations of future exchange rate valuations. I thought your book had an excellent example of the fact that or the self-fulfilling prophecy that makes true what we expect to happen. And how many times have we said this in macroeconomics, that sometimes our actions take on a self-fulfilling prophecy? We think the economy is going to. So as a result, auto sales slow down and the economy is worse because we expected it to happen. We took the steps to make it happen. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, the same thing goes with currency valuations. If everybody expects that a currency is going to be strong and stay strong, then there will be people who will simply buy that currency just to own a currency that's going up in value. And one recent example, this was the Swiss franc. The Swiss franc has been around for a long time. Switzerland never did join the Eurozone, even though it looked like initially they would. Switzerland stayed out of it, and for better or worse, I think if they wanted to join, they would be most welcome. But they've still got their own currency, and it's been rising. It was for a long time been rising in value to the point where Switzerland was trying to sort of bring it down a little bit. It's getting too strong. It's going to hurt their export business. But one reason why I did that is because everybody thought it was a much safer currency than the euro, and so people were buying Swiss francs and buying. Well, any good is everyone's buyers outstrip sellers, the price is going to go up. So as a result, because people thought the Swiss franc was so strong, and in fact, one currency trader said it's too strong, and in fact, that's the problem. It's too strong. People were buying it, and likewise, if people think that currency is going to go down in value, they'll sell those to get out of them to buy some other currency. We saw this happening again with the British pound right after the British people voted to leave the Eurozone. To leave the Eurozone, not the Euro currency zone, but the trade zone. They still have their own currency. Well, for whatever reason, people make a bid around the British pound, and the British pound just got clobbered. It's lost lots and lots of value against other major currencies because of the fact that people, first of all, it was unexpected that British people would have voted to leave, and there's all kinds of questions as to whether or not they should have had a when people were on vacation, not paying attention or whatever, but that's a political question. The economic reality was that people were not expecting the British public to vote against staying in the Eurozone. When they left, the British pound got clobbered, and people just kept punching. And so these expectations, these are traders that are doing this, and they're simply pushing down the value of that currency. Also, differences in inflation rates across nations. So this is important because inflation does what? Weakens the value of currencies. So sometimes inflation rates differ, and sometimes this can be taken advantage of, or it can take advantage of an actor who are looking at these issues. And so right now, one thing that we know that happens is that sometimes if inflation rates are higher in one area than another, people will flee that currency in order to buy another currency, because that currency is by definition getting weaker. So sometimes these are actions of traders. I mean, trader, T-R-A-D-E-R-S, not traders, but traders. That is currency traders who are simply fleeing that currency because of the fact that currency is losing value. And if you're holding a basket of currencies, maybe you don't want to be the one that is rising. And then the last one here is differences in interest rates or simply investment returns, you could say. But interest rates is one simple way to look at that. And that is the idea that if you can find a rate of return on interest in some other country to another country, you'll convert your currency to that currency to take advantage of it. One great example of this was not too long ago, just a few years ago, Japan had higher interest rates on savings and bonds than the rest of the world. And so what was happening was people were simply, this is big hedge funds, investment firms and whatnot, simply taking US dollars, buying yen, and then buying those investments, earning those higher interest rates, converting them back to dollars at some point, because the stability of the yen and dollar was pretty good at that time. But it wasn't about the dollar yen exchange, it was about the interest rate differential. They could earn more safely in Japan on Japan denominated debt than they could anywhere else. And so as a result, they were pushing up the value of the yen. And it was simply what was called the carry trade. They were simply borrowing, and sometimes they would borrow money from US banks, borrowing US dollars, buying yen, buying those investments, and being paid in yen interest, converting it back to US dollars, repaying the debt, pocketing the difference in profit that they would have made. So there are lots of sophisticated plays out there to do that, but some of it simply has to do with interest rate differentials. And in the US, our rates, as low as they were for a very long time, were still much higher than what they were in inflation-adjusted terms. And a lot of the other rest of the world, including like Germany, and then actually negative interest rates in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, for a very long time. Okay. Well, I'm losing my voice, and that's, I guess, okay, because we only got 4 minutes left. But so, questions for me about anything I've talked about to foreign exchange and currency exchange rates? Okay, when we come back next week, I'll get into fiscal policy, and we'll talk about government's actions in the economy. So you might want to kind of have a glance at that in the text before that. And holiday weekend, and I will see you next time.